Welcome back. Today we're at Morley Equestrian and I'm going to show you how to put a saddle on your horse correctly. So our model for today is Ruby and we're going to look at the things you need to think about when you're putting your saddle on the horse to make sure it's in the right place. I would say about 50% of people that I see put their saddle on too far forwards, and today I'm going to show you the correct place to put your saddle on your horse. So sit back, make yourself a cup of tea and hopefully enjoy. So this is Ruby. She's about 16.3, about 10 years old, and she's an Irish sports horse. And today we're going to pop on her event saddle so we can look at where a GP/event saddle should sit on your horse's back. So one of the first things to remember when you put your saddle on is where their scapula sits. So horses have their scapula here, and their scapula is very much like our shoulder blade, but slightly different. So they've got a big bone here, and this bone here, when their front leg moves, their scapula moves like this. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the saddle sits clear enough of this scapula so the horse has full movement of its front legs when you're riding. Because what we don't want to do is restrict the scapula and then they can't use their front legs properly and they end up a bit stumbly and a bit trippy. So first thing we're going to do before we even think about putting our saddle on is have a look at our horse's scapula, this bone here, and feel around the back edge of it here. So this here is the back edge of her scapula. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that the tree sits clearly back behind this bone here. So that, again, she's got that full movement here of her scapula and it can move properly as she's being ridden. What are you spooking at now, darling? What's over there? Are you body conscious? Are you worried about people seeing your scapula? Awoosa. Awoosa. So we're going to get her saddle out and we're going to have a look, and I'm going to show you where the point of the tree is, because that's the part that we need to make sure sits back behind her scapula. So this here, if you look closely, if you lift up the flap of your saddle and you look closely in here, you'll see that the tree, so it varies depending on what saddle you're looking at, it depends, the tree varies greatly, but this is the tree here, and there's usually what's called a point pocket, which is this line of stitching here, and this here is the point of your tree. So this is the point, the bit that has to be 3 fingers width back behind the back of your scapula. So on a GP or jump or event saddle in this case, there's often saddle in front of that point. So this is the point that has to sit back behind your horse's shoulder. This stuff in front of that is flexible and therefore can sit over your horse's shoulder if necessary. So if you think about a jump saddle, for example, that's really forward cut, it might come even further forward than this one. That's fine to sit on the shoulder, as long as this point here is behind the back of your scapula. Not your scapula, the horse's scapula. You don't wear the saddle, that would be weird. So as long as this point here is back at least 3 fingers width behind the back of your horse's scapula, then your horse is free to move its shoulder and its front leg. So now we know where the point of the tree is, we need to make sure that that point of the tree sits at 3 fingers width behind the back of her scapula. So when we pop the saddle onto her back, do you remember at Pony Club when you were taught how to put saddles on, they told you to put the saddle on the back too far forward and then kind of shugle it back until it finds its natural place? Well, with some horses actually that natural place doesn't really exist. You could kind of keep shugling and it doesn't really sort of stop anywhere. Ruby's one of those horses. So with her we're going to put it on here and we're going to shugle it back a little bit until maybe it feels like it's almost in the right place. Have a look at it, and then we're going to feel for the back of her scapula. So I use my hand and I palpate, and palpate means basically feel with your hand. We're going to palpate all around her scapula here until we come to the back of it here. So this here is the back of her scapula, this here is the point of the tree, and we want 3 fingers gap. So on her, that would mean the saddle sits about here. So you might see the saddle sitting here and see how much, there's a huge amount of shoulder here in front of the saddle. And so some people would see this and think, oh my gosh, the saddle's too far back. So therefore they'd move it forward. Currently how the saddle is sitting now is quite balanced. If we were to move it forward so that it was sitting on her scapula, then we see how the angle of the saddle changes massively. So your weight's going to be right at the back of the saddle here, and we don't want that. We want your weight to be nice and central. So when we move it back here to behind the scapula, where it should be, the seat is sitting much more centrally, so the rider will sit much more balanced. So that's point number 1, is to make sure that we sit it well clear of the back of the scapula. When we've done that, we want to feel for her last rib. Some horses have got quite a lot of their own padding, so it's more difficult to find their ribs. But if you pop back, I've done a video about how to find their last rib, so I'll pop a link up to it there. So if you don't know how to find your horse's last rib, that's the way to do it. Have a pop and watch that, and then pop back here. So we're going to find her last rib, we're going to follow the line of it up, we're going to make sure the saddle doesn't come back past her last rib. So we've ticked the boxes, both the boxes there for that. So now we know roughly where the placement of the saddle sits. Let's start thinking about how to tack her up. Before you even think about tacking your horse up, you need to make sure that they're safely tied up. So Ruby here is tied up to some rather snazzy pink baler twine, and she is safely tied up, so we know that she's safe and secure and she's not going to disappear off into the distance while we're trying to tack her up. Equally, she's tied to a bit of baling twine, so we know that she's not going to hurt herself if she does pull back. Ruby here has a nice high-withered, new-made high-withered Griffin saddlecloth, and when we look at this on her back, we can see why they're a really good shaped saddlecloth. Can we see how nice and high it sits here? It's got a really nice shape to it. I say to a lot of people that these are really good saddlecloths, as are the Lemure ones. It's kind of an almost rigid spine through here, so it means that it sits nicely up into the saddle. Because we spend so much time fitting your saddle and making sure your saddle sits clear of the withers, that we don't want the actual saddlecloth itself to sit and rub on the withers. So you want something that sits nice and clear and sits right up into the length of the gullet of the saddle. So this one's really good for that. Also, this one has the little D-ring attachment. So these are really good because it means they attach to the D-ring rather than to the girth straps, and it means also they're attached a little bit further forward. Sometimes with these Velcro straps attachments, they're sewn on a little bit further back here, and they're literally right on one of the main pressure points of the saddle. I often see horses that have got like a little white square here where they've actually got a saw developed where the little bit of Velcro has been sewn on. So these ones where it sits further forward are much better. So we've got a saddlecloth on, now it's time to put the saddle on. On we pop, and we make sure that we lift the saddlecloth right up along that whole gullet of the saddle so it sits right clear of her spine. And then we can do up our little attachments here. And again, these ones go straight into the D-rings at the front of the saddle, and that holds it nice and securely. And then we check again that we're nice and clear of her scapula, so the saddle's in the right place, nice and clear of her scapula, nice and clear of her last rib, and then we can start to think about girthing. Now, as we can see with Ruby, she's one of these horses that has a curved girth. Can we see a nice curve in this girth? So we can see when we look at her why she might be a candidate for one of these girths. Because when we put the saddle in the correct place behind this massive shoulder that she's got, and we look up in here, we see that the girth straps naturally want to hang here. Now that is because we've had to put the saddle so far back because her shoulder is so massive and her scapula's got so much movement in it that we need to put the saddle back clear of it. And that has resulted in the girth straps sitting here. When you have a horse with a stomach, cover your ears, Ruby. When you have a horse with a stomach that's a little bit more rotund, then what happens is the most narrow part of their body is very much behind their elbow. So what happens is the girth tends to get sucked forward into this part here behind their elbow. So if her girth hangs down here, but it wants to hang down here, what's going to happen is that girth is going to get sucked forward. So once we've got our saddle on, we know the placement is right, we need to check where our girth straps hang, and then we need to girth accordingly. So with her, she needs one of these curved girths, and what that does is it hangs down there, and we can see this nice curve here allows that to sit where it wants to sit, whilst allowing the saddle to sit in the correct positioning. On a saddle that has 3 normal straps like this, so 3 straps coming from the centre of the saddle, like most GP saddles have, you normally go for the first and the third, unless your saddle fitter tells you any differently. So this here is a standard 3 girth strap saddle. So now, there are so many different strapping configurations on different brands of saddles, but the majority of standard saddles have this configuration here. There are plenty of others, for example, Kenton Masters, Thoroughgood, etc., who the first strap actually is a point strap, but we'll do an entire different video about that at a later date. So if yours doesn't look like this under here, then please ignore the advice I'm giving, because there are lots of different setups, but this particular setup with first strap on the first bit of webbing coming from the midpoint here, and the second and third on this other bit of webbing, you must never use the 2 straps that come from the same bit of webbing, just in case there's a problem with the webbing and the webbing itself snaps. I hope that makes sense. So for 2 reasons you don't want to use those straps. Number 1, because if you were to use the second and the third strap and that bit of webbing snapped, then your entire girth would come off. Whereas if you use the first and the second, or the first and the third, and one of the bits of webbing snapped, you've still got the other bit of webbing holding you on. Now the other reason is, for a horse like Ruby for example, we've already discussed that her girth sits slightly further back than her girth groove wants it to. So for her, if we were to put on the last two straps, we're going to end up with a girth sitting even further back. So with her we want to go first and third to spread the weight nicely and then use a curved girth. When you put your girth on, you need to make sure that you tuck it in through these girth loops. So sometimes the saddle cloths just have a loop here, sometimes they have Velcro on it, but whatever you do, you should always tuck it through there. Now if your saddle cloth has these girth loops that sit underneath the flap of your saddle, then your saddle cloth doesn't fit your saddle. Your girth loops like this should always be so that you can get your girth through it without pulling the saddle cloth itself down, because you want everything to sit kind of nice and neatly and snug, and you don't want to be pulling down on the saddle cloth because that pulls it down where you've just lifted it up nicely through there. So if when you're putting your girth on you realise that your girth, these nice little loops here, sitting underneath the saddle, then you need to change your saddle cloth. Another thing is about how your saddle cloth sits is that you need to make sure that it sits clear of the panel of the saddle at the back. You want the saddle cloth to come sticking out. You don't want this end to end underneath the panel itself. Again, if the saddle cloth itself ends underneath that panel, you get a massive pressure point, and it means your saddle cloth is too small for your saddle. You need to get another one. So we've done our girth strap up on the first and the third, and then we need to tighten it gradually. You never want to tighten your girth as tight as it can go ever, let alone straight away. It's always much kinder to the horse if you do the girth up one hole at a time. So as you're tucking up, getting ready, finding your hat, putting your gloves on, all of that, it's much kinder to the horse if you can do it up one hole at a time, each side. Now another thing to remember is to always do it up evenly on both sides. So don't always do it up on the left hand side. So I don't want to see hole 7 on the left and hole 1 on the right, because then your saddle will sit unevenly. You want to go 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, etc. In an ideal world, if your girth is the correct length, you'll end up on about hole 3 or 4 on both sides when you're riding. And that's because if your girth is too short, it can be difficult to get on. And if your skirt is too long and you end up on hole 7 or 8, it means A, you've got a lot of bulk under your leg where the girth buckle sits, and B, it also means that your girth pressure isn't distributed properly. So hole 3 or 4 is a good hole to end up on when you're riding. Often I see people who saddle slip, and actually you find, and they're up on the top hole each side, and you find sometimes it's as simple as putting a slightly shorter girth on, and then the girth sits in the correct place and doesn't slip quite so much. So that's another tip. So try and end on hole 3 or hole 4 on your girth strap. So that was looking at a GP/event saddle, which is more forward cut. Now this is a dressage saddle. So dressage saddles by their very nature are much straighter cut. And what that means is they sit slightly differently behind the shoulder. So again, we still need to make sure that the point sits at least 3 fingers back behind the scapula. But on a dressage saddle, the point is much closer to the front of the saddle. So where does the point sit on a dressage saddle? Well, when you lift up your flap here, the point actually is here, right at the front of the saddle. So with a dressage saddle, you haven't got to kind of fish around underneath where the knee comes forward here. It's actually the front of the saddle. Usually the point of a dressage saddle is right at the front because they come down straight. So the tree of the dressage saddle comes straight down here, and therefore to feel the back of the scapula, you just need to be able to feel the back of the scapula here is 3 fingers width away from the point, which on a dressage saddle is right at the front here. So that's the difference between where a dressage saddle sits compared to where a GP/event/jump saddle sits, in that the GP/event/jump saddle, they come forward here, so you have to come underneath the knee to be able to feel where that part of the tree is, or you need to look under here to see where that part of the tree is. But on a dressage saddle, that point of the tree is right at the front, so we can feel the back of her scapula is here, the point of the tree is here, so that's how it would sit on her, because we know that that point is at the front of the tree. So once you've done all of your straps up, everything's done up, you've got your hat on, you've got your gloves on, you're ready to go, do one last check. Anyone that sees me put a saddle on will see just before the rider gets on, I always put my hand through here and I just check that we can still feel that back of the scapula there is clear of that point of the tree there. Again, check that it hasn't moved back, check you're still clear of that last rib here, and check that your girth looks like it's sitting nicely. I hope you found that useful. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and comment below. I love getting questions, I love answering questions, and don't forget I do loads of videos. So if you do subscribe, you can press that notification bell and it'll tell you when my next video comes out. Lovely spending this time with you. Thank you, take care and keep smiling.